But this evening, we have a discussion on the first year of Giorgia Meloni's government, populists or pussycats. John Hooper, who's the Italy and Vatican City correspondent for The Economist, who's been living in Italy for 20 years, before that in Spain, has written a very well-received book on the Italians, Bargellini Updated, and a man of letters who nowadays lives in Florence, which is great. And holding the chair is our dear friend Morgan Fiumi, who is the governor of the British Institute of Florence, also chair of the governors at the International School, another very well-known man around town, born in Florence, then went to America, made his fortune, and came back again. So, and now lives here very permanently. That's great. So over to these guys for the conversation.
Thank you, Simon, very much for that warm introduction, and welcome everyone to this evening. I'm thrilled to be here with John. Besides being a great friend, I think the foremost expert on all intricacies of things Italian and the Vatican as well. So it's always an engaging and interesting conversation. So we were here just about a year ago when Meloni had just been elected, and we were contemplating what was in store for Italy, but also for its international foreign policy. So maybe we can start there. One of the concerns was Italy's dedication to Atlanticism and ties with the United States. How have those changed, or have they changed in the last year?
No, I think in that area, she has absolutely stuck to the Atlanticist script, backing Ukraine, despite the fact that a number of people who support her party are skeptical, and indeed a lot of Italians generally are skeptical because of historical links to Russia and a concern about getting drawn into a wider conflict. The situation at the moment, though, remains that Italy is four square behind Ukraine and is also very much falling into line with the United States on a policy towards the conflict at the moment between Israel and Hamas in the Middle East. I was seeing today, in fact, a report that a consignment of armaments, US armaments, left yesterday from Sigonella, the base on Sicily. So in that respect, very much keeping to the script and trying to achieve, and I think with some success, a working relationship with Joe Biden, who is somebody of a very different political outlook to Giorgia Meloni.
And what about China? Italy is, I think, the last member of the G7, which is still part of the Chinese Beltway, Road and Beltway Initiative.
Yeah,
which is a grand plan to create routes of trade through a scheme of large investments in infrastructure. And Italy is going to be the head of the G7 in the next meeting. How has that relationship changed with China?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big problem for Italy. How to get out of the Belt and Road Initiative without upsetting the Chinese so much that it really seriously affects trade. Meloni must be regretting that Italy ever got involved with the initiative, which it did, by the way, under a previous populist government of a very different stripe. And that was when the Five Star Movement was in power. So yeah, Italy has important trade links, as does every other country in Western Europe with China, and actually being seen to pull out is going to be tricky. But as you say, they need to be out really by the time that Italy is chairing the G7. So I think it's going to be done with as much delicacy as possible and trading as much as possible on the historic links between Italy and China that go back, of course, to Marco Polo, if indeed he ever did get to China. But we skate over that.
Yeah. Great. So you mentioned the Ukraine. Obviously, when this government came into power, there was it's a coalition government, and the two other parties seem to be sympathizers with Putin and more aligned with Russia. It seems like she's held a sort of steadfast support for Ukraine.
Yes, and I think that has also characterized the attitude of, well, first of all, Forza Italia, free of Silvio Berlusconi, in the sense that he was closely involved with Putin personally, though the party itself was not particularly pro-Russian. The League, on the other hand, did have an organic relationship with Putin's party, and there's quite a lot of evidence to point in the direction of them getting funds from Russia, though the case has never been proven. So the fact that the coalition has held steady in support of Ukraine is relatively surprising, and I think is testament to the fact that the Brothers of Italy party, led by Giorgia Meloni, is overwhelmingly the majority party within the coalition. It got up to over 30% at one stage in the polls, and currently is around about 28%. The League, on the other hand, is around about 9%, though improving recently. And Forza Italia is down to below 7% right now. So, you know, she is very much holding the whip hand in terms of popularity. But nevertheless, at the cabinet table, they are well represented, both parties. So she has to be careful of that, and particularly of Salvini, who will jump on her at the slightest provocation.
Do you think that this support for Ukraine has gained the support of the countries like the United States and Britain, and that has helped her in a way get away with some of the cultural wars that she's sort of been initiating?
Yeah, I mean, when we were talking a year ago, the scheme that I outlined then was that at the international level, she would toe the line, and that there would be nothing very extreme or populist about her policies. That at the domestic level, that is where she might give cut some slack to her more extreme supporters. And that in the middle, there was a big question mark, because we didn't quite know how that was going to play out in Europe. And I think that actually has held up as a schema, and it has definitely allowed her to impose more radical right-wing policies in some areas domestically. I mean, how much of this we're going to see in the future, I think, depends on a number of variables. But she has clamped down on surrogacy, surrogate births, by making it a universal offense. That's to say that previously couples could go and hire a surrogate mother in another country, even though it's illegal in Italy. Now they cannot do that. That said, there has not been the kind of extreme clamp down that we've seen in other countries. In fact, actually, I was talking to someone who I think actually may be in the audience tonight, who received a telephone call from the United States from a friend or relative, I forget which, saying, "Oh my God, I hear that you've got a fascist government in Italy." And his response was, "You're calling from Florida." your governor is pulling books out of the library. So let's keep this into perspective. Having said that, this government is in its early stages. It's still feeling its way. And I think that in the event of a real crisis, we might see Meloni fall back on more traditional policies of her party. So far, it's been limited, but as I say, it's early days.
And just going back to the Ukraine stance, do you think that this sort of relationship with Zelensky, do you think it's helped Italy not be marginalized from the other countries?
Not be marginalized by America, yes. But what is quite clear is that Italy does not have that seat at the high table that it had with Mario Draghi. If tomorrow Scholz and Macron were to get onto a train to Kiev in the way that happened with the French president and the German chancellor at the outset of the war, they would not be inviting along Meloni in the way that they invited along Mario Draghi. They've made it quite clear that they are suspicious of her. You can see this in the body language that Macron uses when he's with her. There have been quite a lot of friction with France, particularly over migration. And Scholz has not been particularly warm. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, Italy is more isolated than it was. And as of yesterday, more isolated still, because it had a kind of three-way, belonged, if you like, to a three-way alliance with Hungary and Poland, all governed by right-wing populist parties. And what happened in the elections in Poland at the weekend was that the combined opposition got more votes and more seats than the ruling populist Law and Justice Party, known by its initials as the PIS. I won't pronounce that because you know these Polish names are very tricky. Although we don't know for certain that the opposition will be able to form a coalition, it's got a way to go. There's a lot of opposition parties, and almost certainly the president will ask the War and Justice Party to form a government or try to form a government, knowing perhaps that they're going to fail because they have got, as a party, the most votes. So we're not there yet. It looks very much as if the next Prime Minister of Poland is going to be Donald Tusk, who is a moderate center-right figure, definitely not somebody who is up for any kind of populism. And that really leaves Italy in a difficult position because the only obvious ally left is Hungary with Viktor Orban. And that's a very different kind of radical rightism than was represented by the government in Poland, which was pro-Ukrainian. And Orban, on the other hand, has been overtly pro-Russian. So that makes it very difficult for Giorgia Meloni. She has been to Hungary, she embraced Orban, but relations were not as friendly as they were with the Polish government party with the unpronounceable initials.
Interesting. A recent poll found that 45% of the Italians were now opposed to sending arms to Ukraine versus 34% that were still in favor. How much of a risk is that, do you think?
I think it's always going to be a bit of an Achilles heel because if Salvini sees this as a possibility to regain more popularity, then I think he will make life difficult for her. we've already seen that in the last couple of months, that he has been snapping at her heels over other issues where, particularly immigration, where he has felt that she has not been sufficiently radical. So I think he's quite capable of doing that over Russia if he feels that events are really going his way. But I think at the moment, it's not such an issue at the forefront of people's minds that he can capitalize on it. I think people at the moment are more worried about inflation getting to the end of the month, and interest rates, mortgages, etc., to be overly concerned about the conflict between Ukraine and Russia.
So it seems like this first year, Meloni has kept a pretty amicable rapport with the European Union, but it seems like storms are brewing on the horizon. One of them is the recovery fund, resilience and recovery fund, which Italy is really struggling to implement.
Yeah.
It's sort of a financing plan, but it's tied to the implementation of certain reforms and investments, and Italy is struggling to implement those.
Yeah. In fact, it's only just managed to put into the bank, so to speak, the amount that it applied for at the end of last year. So there's been a very long delay while Brussels wrangled over the use of some of the money. And some of that money, by the way, the issue was right here in Florence, because the money was going to be used for the refurbishment of the football stadium, soccer stadium, on the grounds that it would revitalize a deprived area of the city. Then when Brussels looked into it a little bit more deeply, they saw that Campo di Marte is actually the third richest area in Florence, and were slightly reluctant to hand over those funds. There was another problem up in Venice over another sports stadium, and these were key issues that vexed the Commission. Now, all of that's now been resolved, but we're well behind schedule. And in the meantime, the minister in charge of implementing the recovery fund and making sure the money is spent, and it has to be spent. I mean, this is the real problem. The money has to be spent so incredibly quickly. It has to actually be dispersed by the end of 2026, which is a huge challenge for a country that is trying to spend 200 billion euros. Now, what he's done is to say some of this is not going to happen. We now realize that and cut that money out, much to the chagrin of some of the local and regional authorities in Italy, which feel that if the money had come to them, they could have dealt with it. And that's a fundamental problem with this fund, because in the north, they are not going to have any difficulty spending the money, but they're not going to be getting proportionately as much as is going to the south. One of the objectives is to level up, to use the British political phrase, and try and get the south to get back onto a similar footing to the north. The problem is that in the south, there is not the administrative capacity to really deal with that amount of money. And that is going to be a big problem in the future, in the near future.
In fact, it seems that the Meloni government has asked the EU for certain concessions, and that seems to be one of the first ones that hasn't gone their way. The second one, it seems to be an impasse around the budget. Can you elaborate on that? It seemed like in 2023, we were still under certain, I would say, leniency from the pandemic, but that has now ended. And so while the 2023 budget was accepted, so to speak, by the EU, the 2024 budget seems like there was quite a disconnect.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you put your finger on it. This year's figure for the deficit has gone up quite strikingly. The next year, I think, there was what worried the Commission, but more than the Commission, the markets, because the increase was this year. The increase can largely be ascribed to a policy that was also adopted by the five-star government, which was to give people this strong incentive for home improvements and energy efficiency. The idea was that you got 110% tax break, and it is costing the Treasury a fortune. And it is why this year's deficit is going to be so high. So the Commission was kind of, and the markets, I think, were prepared to say, okay, well, this was a one-off. You inherited this. That's not a problem. But then the government decided in its wisdom that it was going to have a bigger, significantly bigger deficit than originally projected next year. And then the finance minister came out and blithely said that they wouldn't really be reducing the debt for a number of years, out to about 2026. And there would be a marginal difference. Plus, the medium-term strategy paper was adjusted so that this next year there is what most analysts would call a very optimistic assumption for growth. So whether the debt comes down at all is looking highly questionable. Now, against that background, it's kind of surprising that the Commission didn't freak out a bit more than it actually did. There is a theory that a deal was cut, and that the Commission has kept its voice down about all this because it wants Italy to sign up to the European Stability Mechanism, the bailout fund, which Italy has never really wanted to do, and is now the only country in the euro which isn't signed up to that mechanism. And that could explain why the markets did get very worried about this and remain very worried about it, and have pushed Italian interest rates up, because investors in Italian debt, Italian bonds, what they want is a higher return on their investment because of the greater risk that they foresee as a result of Italy just spending more than it's actually, if you like, earning, the government doing so.
So the spread, so the difference, the gap between the interest that the Italian bonds are yielding versus the German bonds right now are 186 basis points, so 1.86%. But the forecasts, some predictions say they'll go as high as 2% or 2.10% by the end of the year.
And it did touch 2%, in fact, briefly after the budget details were announced.
What does that, how does that translate to, I guess, the repercussions on the economy and to the lives of everyday Italians?
Okay, two different things, but very much connected. It means that the government, as it goes to market to renew its debts, has to pay a higher interest rate than it was paying just a few months ago. So at the moment, it's probably paying around about 5%, or offering 5% at these bond auctions, which means that the bill for servicing this huge debt, and it is over 140% of Italy's GDP, it's the second biggest debt in the EU. It means that burden grows heavier. It doesn't leap straight to 5% straight away because it's a gradual process. And that is the 5% is the price in the secondary market. But so that's for the government. The government has less room for maneuver, if you like, even less than it had already, which is not good news. For ordinary people, it means that if they are on variable rate mortgages, they're going to be paying more, and they're already being squeezed by inflation. So that is really a problem that the government could be facing in the near future. And it explains to some extent, why Meloni decided that she needed to have a budget deficit next year, because there are tax giveaways in the budget being discussed. Exactly what's going to happen, we don't know, because the budget is a long drawn-out process, as you well know, in Italy. We are going to be going through right the way probably until after Christmas on fast form, and then all kinds of modifications will be put into the budget. So there's still plenty to play for, but the overall strategy is one that worries the markets and has led to an increase in interest rates.
I think there was an estimate that the increase in interest rates translate into an additional 14 billion euros a year in interest, and that's without lowering any of the deficit. What kind of strategies do they have to sort of tackle that? They've discussed everything from selling off state assets, which of course seems to go against some of the other narrative around the favoring state intervention over free markets. How do they reconcile that? What options do they have, if any?
Yeah, you're touching on another reason why the markets got worried, which is that some of the strategy involves these savings to be made from flogging off state assets, privatizing, and by clamping down on tax evasion. And the reaction of analysts is, we've heard this so many times in the past, and it doesn't happen. And also, this is a government which has already given a number of little tax amnesties and not in a wink measures to people who might not be paying all of their VAT. So there's skepticism on that. And on the savings, again, they've heard this all before. So that is an extra reason why investors have been worried. What is the strategy that they have? I mean, I can't see one that is going to bring in the debt in the way that they foresee. And there is this added dimension, as you say, that not only is privatization quite a tricky operation to pull off in any economy, but the economic philosophy of the party that Meloni leads is one which is actually in origins pretty anti-capitalist, and which has been relatively anti-free market, in the sense that neo-fascism, and the Brothers of Italy party grows out of the old neo-fascist movement. Neo-fascism, as people have often remarked, the two extremes of politics are not at either end of the spectrum, they are at either ends of a circle, and they meet up. And neo-fascism was profoundly anti-capitalist and very suspicious of free markets, in favor of statism, state intervention. And so against that background, you can see that they're not going to be the most enthusiastic people to back Thatcherite privatization.
Which takes me back, I guess, to the question on the strength of the coalition. Of course, La Lega and Forza Italia were came out of sort of much more free market orientation. How are they, again, reconciling with this move? I mean, it seems like the industrialists in the north are pretty spooked right now.
Yeah, I mean, this has been I think, the big surprise. I talked about that schema earlier on, whereby, they would be pretty conventional in their international policy, that they might be quite radical in their domestic policy, and then in between Europe, we didn't know. What I left out was economics. What would be their economic policy? We didn't really have any hint beforehand. And in the summer, we got a big surprise, which was that late at night, Salvini, who was standing in for Meloni as the prime minister, his deputy prime minister, one of the two, announced that they were introducing a tax on the windfall profits of the banks as a result of the higher interest rates. The banks make more money when interest rates are higher, and they can manipulate things so that they get even more by introducing a lag between the rate at which they borrow and the rate at which they lend. So this was a classic populist measure, which came out of the blue. And nobody had been expecting this. And there is a big question mark over whether this was actually Salvini's idea or whether it was Meloni's. But Meloni afterwards said, no, it was my idea. I take full ownership of this idea, and we're not going to change it. Now, in fact, they have slightly changed it. They've ensured that the smaller, more vulnerable banks don't get hit as hard as had been originally foreseen. And what came out of this was really two things. I mean, one of them was that this reeked of incompetence, frankly. You don't signal such a dramatic turn in your economic policy at 11 o'clock at night in August without consulting anybody, what's more. Because Tajani, who is the other deputy prime minister, said, I knew nothing about this. He is the Forza Italia deputy prime minister. Equally, it showed up that something that's been suspected from the beginning, and most established parties have around them a circle of think tanks and research departments, and people in them who are often described as mind detectors. These are the bright young women and men who will put up a hand and say, hey, have you talked to the Bank of Italy about this one? Have you talked to X? What would be the implications for Y, et cetera, et cetera. None of this seems to have happened, and it all emerged afterwards. So, for example, though the measure itself sounds very egalitarian, if you like, rather fair, and indeed, if applied properly, and it was applied in other countries in the EU, including Spain, could have actually been quite a successful move. But nobody seemed to think about the fact that Italy's got a very frail banking system, and every so often they do need an injection of cash to strengthen their capital reserves. And nobody seemed to think about the risk to the much smaller banks, of which Italy has many. And nobody seemed to have talked to the ECB about this either. So the whole thing was frankly a bit of a fiasco. But the other side of it is that it showed that this was a government that in certain areas would stick with overtly populist policies. And since then, there have been at least two other measures that have been in the same line. One of them, and again, I mean, just as your hearts don't break, I'm sure, for the profits of the banks, They don't break for the profits of Ryanair, but the government decided that it was going to introduce a measure to cap surge pricing on the routes to the islands, the big islands, Sardinia and Sicily. Again, it's a populist measure. It could be a popular measure. Again, though, nobody seems to have thought much about what kind of reaction that would have among northern industrialists, because they look at that and they say, well, you're interfering with the free market there. Okay, Ryanair, but am I next? And there is another much more technical measure that has to do with corporate governance, which again has, to those who've understood it, sent the signal, these guys are populists and they are doing what, admittedly, they were elected to do. But, we need to take that on board. And a lot of are not at all keen that this is happening.
The average Italian government, I think, lasts 14 months, and the economy seems to be one of the main factors in bringing down these often fragile coalitions. Was this a measure? Do you think it would be a bit of a desperate measure to try to shore up the budget, or do you think this is really a trend to appease the base?
I think it was more the former. I think that they saw the near future coming, that there wouldn't be much of a margin with the budget. And here was, a couple of really easy ways to raise cash, particularly for the one from the banks. And that could be put into the treasury, and therefore some more of the policies could be, some more of the promises, rather, that had been made during the election campaign could be fulfilled at the first budget, which is kind of surprising, because this is a government that is sitting very comfortably. And Ms. Meloni's party is sitting pretty comfortably in terms of its holdings. And it's not one that is facing a serious challenge from the opposition, which is split right now in the middle between the Democratic Party and the Five Star Movement. And it's a truism of politics that, you do the unpopular stuff at the beginning, you then go through a midterm popularity dip, and then you come out with the goodies in the second half. Whereas this is a budget that's going to try to give a few of the goodies right at the start. And I'm not sure that they've made a very clever political calculation in that respect. Yeah, I think that it was very much motivated, to answer your question, by let's find some money and therefore we can implement a few of our promises. Maybe that has to do with not looking so much at the opposition, but looking at her ally, looking at Salvini. I think that he is a big worry for her, and perhaps more of a worry than he ought to be, sitting on 9% in the polls.
I think when this tax was announced on the banks, the market value, the bank was down over 10 billion, and they had to
in the morning.
Yeah, in the morning.
Yeah.
Do you think they've learned from this, or do you think, again, other industries are next?
No, I think for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, the fact that two other measures have come in afterwards, I think they may have learned, oops, you don't make major policy statements without doing a few checks first. But whether they've, quote unquote, learned in the sense of you need to have a more conventional economic policy, that I'm more skeptical about. I think that there is an economic philosophy that is quite happy to interfere with the workings of the free market, and that's something that the guys up in Milan are going to have to cope with. we shall see. But the signs so far are that they want to plow ahead with a decidedly interventionist economic policy.
Another area that seems like Meloni government hasn't really gotten what they wanted from the EU has been immigration, or at least there isn't a comprehensive deal yet. It seems like their desires to curtail the NGOs providing assistance, as well as going to the source and providing financial incentives to those countries that are sort of a transit place for how big of an issue is this?
I think electorally it's very big, and I think it's a big worry for Meloni. I find the Brothers of Italy approach to immigration very interesting, because I think that they are, here I really do give them credit, they are the first party to have actually told the truth to Italians. They've said that immigration is necessary. Now, they then go on to say, but not this immigration, not these guys arriving on boats from Africa. But they do say we are short of labor. They do recognize that Italy's welfare state cannot survive with such a low birth rate as at present without importing people of working age to pay contributions, to pay for the pensions of the elderly, the disabled, and so on. And they have tried to give answers. One of them is we're going to boost the birth rate. And that was actually #1 issue on the electoral manifesto of the Brothers of Italy party. We're going to get Italian women to breed more than they have up until now. And the other side of the policy is we're going to go to Africa and we're going to invest so that their economies start to thrive and these people stay where they are until such time as we bring them in as maybe legal immigrants. Now, the problem with both of those solutions is they're long term. They're not solving the immediate problem. Okay, even if suddenly Italian women are seized by a desire to have more children, we're not going to see the results in the labor force for at least 18 years. That's, I mean, my maths is not the best, but I can work that one out. And the other is, again, a slow process. You know, you don't revive economies overnight. And there is a whole debate amongst economists over whether, in fact, greater intervention, investment in poor countries does actually lead to the results that you're seeking. So what happened was that, as you indicated, Meloni fell back on the tactic that had been used in the past, which was to go to North Africa, from where most of the seaborne migrants set off, and say, for God's sake, can you just keep these people in your place and stop them from coming to our place? And she thought that she'd cut a deal along with Ursula von der Leyen with the president of Tunisia, who is thoroughly authoritarian character. And they had promised him large amounts of money. What seems to have happened is that after objections were raised by a number of countries over his human rights record, the money then got a bit snaggled up in Brussels and didn't get to Tunis, at which point he then turned on the tap again and more people arrived, as we saw on Lampedusa a few weeks ago. And that is the situation at the moment. Probably because of the onset of autumn, the numbers will go down, but the numbers this year are going to be very high. They're going to be very close, and maybe even in excess of the peak year of 2019. 2016. And so all of that really leaves Giorgia Meloni with a big problem, because that was a very important factor in the election of her government, and there is no obvious solution at the moment. In the meantime, quite interestingly, what Italy has done, what the government has done, is to increase very substantially the number of legal immigrants to be allowed into Italy over the next 3 years. It's a very big boost. But whether boosting the number of legal immigrants is going to deter anybody who had plans to come in illegally, I really have my doubts. And for as long as those people arrive very visibly, she has a big political problem. And that's, in fact, as I was saying earlier, where Salvini has been snapping at her heels, because he's asking for radical measures and saying, once you favored a naval blockade of North Africa, why aren't we trying something similar to that? Mm-hmm.
So if going back to sort of this trend towards populism, one of the things that we see in more populist regimes is a crackdown on freedom of speech and the press. By default, the government owns the majority of the TV channels, like the RAI are controlled by the government, and then there's Mediaset, obviously controlled by Forza Italia directly. What have you seen in that regard?
There has undoubtedly been a move to put people sympathetic to the government into key positions, including that of the Director General of the RAI. And you on one side, you react to that thinking, well, the center left has had a very good run over the years in RAI. There's been a long history of people of progressive views, fronting programs, producing programs, editing programs. So maybe it was about time that the right got a fair crack at the whip. What that leaves out is the point that you just mentioned, which is that because of the way in which commercial non-state television in this country grew up with Berlusconi, 3 of the 7 main channels are already controlled by one of the parties in the coalition. And indeed, what we've seen recently is that not those channels, in some cases, not really backing so much the Forza Italia view of the world, but in many cases much closer to the Brothers of Italy view of the world. Then you've got RAI with its 3 channels, and up until now, there's been this system which was inherited from the old days of Christian democracy, whereby the first channel really supported government of the day, the second channel tended to be more to the right, and the third channel tended to be more to the left, or markedly to the left. If you then replace people lock, stock, and barrel in the RAI, then you've got 6 channels out of 7, maybe 5 if RAI 3 is left to be the leftist channel, all supporting the government. And I think one area where this has been very important is with regard to climate change, because there has been a wave of climate skepticism on Italian television and in the Italian media more widely, at a point at which suddenly doing the right thing has started to have very obvious costs for the general public at a time when there is already inflation. So that is, I think, a big challenge, not really for the government, but for for all of us.
This year, obviously, Italy having been really heavily impacted by the change in weather patterns. The north, I mean, over $1 billion of damages. And part of the recovery fund also speaks to some of the investments that have to be made in sustainable flooding prevention and these sorts of measures. So on one hand, she needs the money. On the other hand, she has to deal with her skepticism within the party.
Yeah, which I think is being amplified, if you like, by the media at the moment, by the more conservative media. Yeah, I mean, the costs are obvious. The dangers are obvious. You only have to look at what has been happening in Greece this summer to see what could very easily happen in Italy, and indeed did happen to some extent, to quite a large extent, on Sicily, in Sicily. Yeah, and Italy is extremely vulnerable. I think that's a point that is being lost in all of this. It's in many ways more vulnerable than either Spain or Greece, because it's a long, thin country with a mountainous spine running down the center, which is unusually prone to landslides when there's heavy rain, and which has it has several areas in the south which are as vulnerable to heat waves as anywhere in Spain or Greece. So, you know, that vulnerability, I think, is not getting through to a lot of people in Italy, and is, I fear, going to get through in the most disastrous and, in many cases, lethal way.
So just two more questions. One is, do you think the EU has an interest in seeing the Meloni government succeed or fail?
Definitely, I think they want to see stability, and she is at the moment offering stability. But I think the big question mark is over the particularly the fiscal policy of this government going forward. Can it contain the budget? Does it have a will to pay off the debt? Is it thinking responsibly about the stability of the euro? I thought it was fascinating that just a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3, Meloni said that the usual suspects were plotting to replace her with a technocratic government. This came out of the blue. I mean, nobody had suggested that. And it showed you, first of all, the degree of nervousness. And it raised a question over whether this was a preemptive strike. Had she got wind of something afoot? Because undoubtedly, if it looked as if Italy was going to destabilize the euro, as happened in 2011, I think that the Commission would move in the same way that both the Commission and Italy's partners moved on that occasion, and basically hatched a plot to unseat Berlusconi and replace him with technocrats, which is what happened in the end. Though I have to say that Berlusconi's party actually, under the pressures that were being exerted at the time, lost their confidence in him, and he did actually lose his parliamentary majority in a natural way. But unquestionably, there is that readiness to protect, you know, if it comes down to protecting Europe from a full-blown financial crisis, then I think that Italy's partners and the Commission would be prepared to act. I found it striking that she should raise that possibility. She didn't actually specify who she was talking about. Was she talking about Brussels, or was she talking about the northern industrial bourgeoisie? We don't know.
And then finally, the question we've all been waiting for. Populists or pussycats?
A populist pussycat, and let's not forget that cats can scratch.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, John. Simon, do we have any time for questions?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I think.
we already have one.
Yes, I think if you're up for it, John, we will give people the opportunity to ask a question or two. We haven't got much time, but we can do a few. And we've got one at the back straight away. You need the microphone, otherwise the people on Zoom can't hear.
Hi, I haven't really been paying attention in the last couple of days or weeks, but what is the government's response to what's going on in the Middle East right now?
Muted, I would say. I mean, they have, broadly speaking, backed the US line. They've expressed support for Israel. They've condemned the attacks by Hamas, but at the same time, expressing the desire for some kind of peaceful solution, peaceful resolution. They've not gone out of their way to talk about the situation. They are, to some extent, I think, keeping their heads down on this. But broadly speaking, it has been supportive of Israel and in line with the kind of positions that have been expressed by the United States. And that, to some extent, I think this quietism, if you like, ties in with the fact that Europe has had such difficulty coming up with a united response.
I'm here.
Just a follow-up question on your answer. She can be a pussycat who can scratch. I mean, in Italy, we have this term called trasformismo, which basically applies to all the parties which come to power with big ideas, and then of course they fall into let's say a kind of a mainstream. Now, I think to a certain extent, although you say it's early days, we are in a way seeing that even with this government. But my question is this, in your view, purely an Italian phenomenon, or we are seeing a bit all over the fact that basically politicians, they are caught into this trap through which they have to promise big things, but then in the end, there are so many, let's say, so many obstacles and so many things which are given against which they cannot do anything. Economic policy, migration, all the things that you mentioned. And so therefore, whoever is in power, ultimately they cannot really do and change very much.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I mean, we The Economist did a big briefing recently on trying to look at, what level of threat does the far right pose in Europe? Because what we've seen is what seemed just a few weeks ago to be the situation was the far right again very much on the march in Europe. AfD in Germany doing very well. A far right populist right politician looking to be elected in Slovakia. And it looked as if the Polish election might very well give a third term of office to the Law and Justice Party. Now with what's happened in Poland, we're seeing yet again this tide receding. It seems to come and then go, come and go, but it's certainly been more prominent than recently. And I thought that the conclusion of that piece was actually a very good one, which was that what happens is not so much that people change their ideas when they get into power, but they just find out that a lot of these things just don't work. they would like to be able to do them, perhaps. And in fact, if you look at Meloni's most recent book, not the autobiography, but the interview that she's done with Alessandro Sallusti, and all the ideas are still very much the same as 5 years ago when they were, in favor of a naval blockade and talking about great replacement theory and all of that. So her basic ideas haven't changed that very much, but I think like a lot of parties of that ilk, they get into power and then they discover some, they hit a wall of reality. And I think that, yes, I agree with what you say. I think that has definitely happened with this government. And perhaps part of that reckoning with reality was the bank decree. I think that they will be much more cautious next time when they try to do a swerve on their policies. But the big question mark remains over the economic policy. There, to my surprise, they have held very much to an ideological line. And I'd add this, that pragmatism is often taken as being comforting. They're pragmatic, they'll do the realistic thing. But pragmatists are unpredictable. It goes back to my pussycat that scratch. Somebody who's very ideological, whether you agree or not with what they want to do, they do go in a line. Pragmatists are more inclined to do that. And so they're not necessarily comforting to have in power.
Back here, and that might be enough, but we'll see how we go. So,
I'm afraid there's a climate skeptic down here.
Sorry. Mike.
Yes. I think that a good illustration of the attitude is that under Mario Draghi, there were two super ministries, both of which reflected the aims of the recovery fund, which, because of the volume of money involved, is actually the main tool of leverage that the EU has at the moment. One was called digital transition, and the other one was ecological transition. Now, when Meloni came in, she abolished that straight away, both of them actually. The ecological transition now has just gone back to being a ministry for the environment, headed by somebody who is himself quite skeptical and has said so openly. He said in a recent public meeting, I have the power of doubt. Now, that I think reflects an attitude which is also one that does not see, I think, rather perplexingly, the possibilities for a very positive state intervention program built around promoting green industries, creating a green revolution, having the kind of massive state intervention that you're seeing with the Biden plan. That is absolutely missing from the government's policy at the moment. So I don't see them embracing it anytime soon. And I think that one of the weaknesses of the EU ambitions is that it does very much depend they very much depend for their implementation on national governments who don't necessarily have the same ideas.
Microphone has died. One last
Thank you, and first of all, thank you for this conversation. I very much appreciate it. But my question concerns the recent conflict in Israel and Gaza. And my thought is this: do you think that we have to be afraid that this will fade the light away concerning the conflict in Ukraine? And also a follow-up to the media in Italy, do you think that this might be, let's say, fading the light away concerning how we show what's happening in Ukraine, and we will show more and more what's happening in Israel, and so we'll have a biased view of what's happening in the world? So I just wanted to
I think it's unquestionable. I think it's unquestionable that not only in Italy but elsewhere, these very dramatic events in Israel and in Gaza Strip have distracted attention from Ukraine. There has been some very significant military activity recently with a heavy Russian pushback, which seems to have been stopped by Ukraine, something that would unquestionably have been up there in the headlines had it not been for developments in the Middle East. I think the bigger question, the more, if you like, the realpolitik question is whether this will sap the will of the United States to provide weaponry to Ukraine if it feels that it has to plow significantly larger quantities of weaponry into the Middle East. And I think that we're not going to get the answer to that question until we see how extensive this conflict is going to become. And that depends on developments on the northern border of the state of Israel, rather than the developments immediately in the south and in the Gaza Strip.
Just before we wrap, we have got two questions from the Zoomers in the comments. And Diana, could you comment on the case brought by Meloni, Roberto Fabiano, and the recent sentence against him? And the other question coming in from Danielle Emmett is, how is the anti-LGBT push stance of the Meloni government being received by the Italian populace and by the rest of the EU? Do you expect she'll keep pushing this?
Okay, let me take the second first. It's interesting that I think that the government rather expected that those kind of domestic culture wars measures, if you like, would remain within Italy, that they wouldn't play out outside. And I think that Meloni was disabused of that, not only in her conversations with Scholz and with Macron, but also, for example, when she met Justin Trudeau, and he said in front of her in the, I can't remember whether it was in the press conference or whether he brought it up immediately in their discussions, that he was disappointed to see that there was this anti-LGBTQ feeling in administration. On the question of Saviano, the mountain rather gave birth to a mouse, because the court decided that yes, he was guilty, but he got a suspended sentence of €1,000 fine. So only if he comes out and says again that she is una stronza, which was the remark that got him into trouble, and perhaps will now mean that I get sued. Will he actually have to suffer any kind of penalty? I think the significant thing about that is that she didn't drop the case when she got into office, and that was kind of a warning that the government and the people in it would reserve the right to act against journalists if it saw, or if it felt that they felt that their reputations were being impugned. I would add actually that it's quite an interesting case because it would not come to court in Britain or in many other countries, I think, because calling somebody, he directed the abuse both at her and at Salvini when he was impassioned and talking about immigration, about the fact that people were dying at sea, and he then said that they were that. That would actually be dismissed as common abuse under British law, or English and Welsh law anyway. It would not give grounds for an action for libel. I think that, yes, the disappointing thing is that she felt that she should continue to press ahead with that case. And again, maybe looking over her shoulder at Salvini, because Salvini has always targeted Saviano, and at one stage even threatened to take away his police protection, which could have lethal consequences. So I think that so far, though, we've not seen anything like the kind of moves that have been seen in Poland, that have been seen in Hungary, those kind of moves to clamp down genuinely on freedom of expression, freedom of the media, or indeed the kind of measures, as I pointed out earlier, are being taken in dear old Florida.
Okay, I think on that note, we should probably just adjourn. And before we thank Morgan and John, I invite you all to come have a glass of wine from our seasoned partners, Castellón del Bosco. It's a nice white wine and nice red wine out there tonight. So enjoy that. But before we go, then, we just big thanks to Morgan and to John. Thank you.
Great. Yeah.